Okay, now we're together, I think, on Zoom and on Facebook and for subsequent viewing on YouTube. So thank you everybody for being here this morning on September 11, 2021. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, down through Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, King James Version. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of the heaven." And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the water in the seas, and let the fowl multiply in the earth." And the evening and the morning were the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creatures after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and the beast of the earth after his kind." And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." And God said, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God had created and made. Let's pray. Dear God, is with very mixed feelings that we gather today. This is a celebration or memorial of an occasion in which those of us who are citizens of the United States lost almost 3,000 people. It's also the occasion when we are sobered by the fact that we killed in response hundreds of thousands of people. The experts differ as to how many hundreds, but hundreds of thousands of people in a nation that sent no attackers and apparently had no weapons of mass destruction. We totally forgot. One eye for one eye, one tooth for one tooth. We repaid 1,000 times. So that's heavy on our minds, but we have the privilege now of turning to one of the grandest passages of literature ever written, and an opportunity to understand what it might have meant to those who first heard it and what it could possibly mean for us today. I thank you for Brian Bull, Fritz Guy, for writing these 3 books, and we hope to be sensitive to your presence in our midst. In Christ's name, amen. I am making Forrest, who's now arrived from the airport, and Monty co-hosts, as well as Monty Butler, as well as, I should say, Bronwyn. So here we go. We have our co-hosts. Now, it is our great honor and privilege to hear from Brian Bull about the book he and Fritz Guy wrote called God, Land, and Sky. This is the first of 3 books which we will discuss, written by them. The next one is on the flood, and the third one is on salvation and how we should not only understand it, but experience it. Brian Bull is a scientist with a couple of hundred peer-reviewed papers published. He's also an administrator, has served as chairman of the Department of Pathology and dean of the School of Medicine at Loma University. While watering the plants this morning, I asked myself, is there any more thankless job than being dean of the School of Medicine at Loma University? And I concluded that there is one. That's being dean of the School of Religion there. But those are very, very difficult assignments. So we're grateful to Brian for doing that. Right now, he's working on the question of why is it that COVID-19 kills people? And they're doing very important research on that. He reported to the board of the university on that recently, and in the future, he will present to us what he presented to the board. So we're looking forward to that. So we're very, very grateful that Brian can be with us. I'm sorry that Fritz can't be with us. I hope that he will view this video sometime, maybe. And if he does, I hope he recognizes how much we appreciate his service to our community as well. Fritz has served as a pastor, as an editor, as a professor, as a dean, and as a president of a university. Very few people have done so many things so very well. A lot of people don't know that Fritz is also a great matchmaker. I say that because he is one of the people that made it possible for me and Bronwyn to get together. So I thank Fritz for that as well. So let's get started. And let me begin by asking Brian why he and Fritz wrote this book and what they hoped to accomplish in writing it.
Well, thank you, Dave, for that generous introduction. And am I coming through all right? Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm hearing you well. Yes.
Okay. The reason that we started this project many years ago was because at the time I was a fairly young faculty member at Loma, and he was on the pastoral staff of the university church. And we got to discussing the problem of science and religion. And the problem, as we came to phrase it, was why is there this significant discord between Genesis as usually read and science as commonly understood? And that discord, we thought maybe because between us we had some view of science and some view of theology. Maybe the two of us could get together and write a book that would help explain where the discord came from and hopefully how to lessen it or maybe have it disappear entirely. So the project we undertook was to heal the rift between science as commonly understood and Genesis as usually read. Took us a lot longer than we anticipated. It ended up with 3 books. But in the afterword of book number 3, we claimed that we had, to our satisfaction at least, explained the discord and why it should no longer continue to exist.
Now, one of the things that you say repeatedly is that we need to listen, really listen to what the text says, rather than seeing on the page what we already think is there. And do you want to talk about that? Why is it so important for us to hear Genesis 1 as the first hearers probably heard it?
Well, that's because if we actually do hear it as those first listeners heard it, the reason we talk about listeners is that at the time Genesis would first have been written, most people could not read or write, and so most of the first encounters with the Genesis text would have come from a town crier or the equivalent reading. There would have been obviously some people in town who could read the Hebrew, and others would gather. We sort of picture them gathering under palm trees beside an oasis and listening to the Genesis story being read. So those first hearers heard something quite different from what we now hear when we read Genesis. And it is in that difference that the divide between science and Genesis exists.
As I read your book, it seemed to me that the most basic difference between these two ways of understanding is that in antiquity, the Jewish people thought of there being 2 causes for everything that happens. And that in our time, we think of them as being 4 causes. I gather, if I remember correctly, the 2 causes are God and human beings. And in our time, it would be God and human beings and chance and the laws of nature. But
Yes.
the people of antiquity did not have the last two, they only had the first two. Would you comment on that further, please?
Be glad to, but before I get there, I'm going to need some help. Fritz and I decided after we wrote this book, as we were starting book number 2, that the two of us weren't up to the task. We needed 2 more people. And so we called in reinforcements. And if I might, I'd like to show you pictures of the reinforcements.
Please do.
All right, let me share screen and can the screen be seen?
Yes.
Okay. The 2 reinforcements that we called in are imaginary, but they are extremely useful because in order to explain how the original people heard it and the difference between that and the way we hear it today, we needed a representative of the ancients, the Hebrews, and we needed a representative of the moderns, us. Moshi is obviously the Hebrew. He's a representative of the ancient people who first heard Genesis. And Ian Michael O'Doran is a representative of us. Fritz and I chuckled over this one because if you put the initials of Ian Michael, I.M. O'Doran, we thought that sounded surprisingly like I am modern. And that's how Ian Michael got his name. So here, let me introduce you to Moshi. Now, this is not Moses. This is not the author of Genesis, traditionally. This is an inhabitant of a small village somewhere sitting on an oasis and listening to Genesis being read to them in the cool of the evening. He's got a solid staff there and he walks the paths of the ancient land of promise. And he represents, and his thought patterns represent what the ancient people would have heard when Genesis first was read to them. Today, we've got our representative. He looks a little bit soft in the head, I'm afraid, but maybe that's fair enough. This is our modern, he's a college educated Christian. He's read the Bible in English and he sits down to read Genesis. He comes across something quite different from what Moshi came across. So we're going to introduce the 2 of them to each other, and there they are. And now we have the privilege of sitting Moshi on a rock and having him read Genesis with Ian Michael looking over his shoulder. What is it that the 2 of them are reading? Well, this is the medallion that's on the front of book number 3. And by the time we got to book number 3, we knew exactly what we wanted on the medallion. What we wanted was the 2 world views that each of these 2 people saw in their mind's eye as they read Genesis. The thought bubble helps here. This is what Moshi saw. He saw a world with a sun and a moon and the stars plastered against the inside of the firmament. Now, most people can tell you what was created on every day of creation week, except for day 2. For some odd reason, what God did first after he created light seems to have escaped from our minds, largely, I think, because we don't know what to do with it. In any event, the firmament, the rakia, the vault, covered this world that was in the mind's eye of Moshi as he read Genesis. And as I said before, the sun and the moon and the stars were plastered on the inside of the rakia, the firmament, Above it, of course, were the waters that came down at the time of the flood, and the rain came through windows in this. And that's the picture that Moshi had it when he read Genesis. The picture that Ian Michael gets today is this. It's a picture of the solar system with the planet Earth, the third rocky planet out, circling the sun, and all a very small portion of a huge universe. The equivalent of our universe for Moshi was the sky and the land. That was everything that he knew about and everything he could conceive of. So 3 books, just to tell you this. Now that I've done it, maybe we don't need to go through the 3 books, but that's what we're headed for, is these 2 mental visions and why they are so different. That's why we're going to go into the detail of how the Hebrew got translated so as to inveigle us into imagining what Ian Michael now sees. And that's this solar system, the Earth as a planet, and the universe beyond when we read Genesis. It's not there, but we see that, and the reason why is an interesting story. So with that, let me go back to the standard picture and your question. What were the various active agents in Moshe's world? See how useful Moshi is? I can refer to the world of the ancient Hebrew by just referring to his name. We found these imaginary helpers to be enormously helpful. And when we at the end of it, both Fritz and I thought we had actually invented them in book 1. And I went back and couldn't find them. No, we didn't. It was between book 1 and book 2 that we came to realize we needed Moshi and Ian Michael, and we needed them badly. So Moshe's world, there were only 2 active agents. It was either God that did things, or it was humans. There were no other forces, no other agents that could do things. And anything that humans couldn't do or didn't do was ascribed to God. And that's how we have to read Genesis if we're going to read it the way it would have been originally read and the way the original author intended it to be read. So just 2 active agents. Does that deal with your question?
Yes, on the one hand, but then for us, there are more than 2 active agents.
Ah, yes. And that makes a difference between Moshe's world and Ian Michael's. The 2 additional active agents, well, there's really 1 with an addendum, is science and nature. So we think of agents in our world as being 3, with a 4th, the agent of chance, having come in some respects to have assumed the place of God as an agent in Moshe's world, because chance now does pretty much everything that humans don't do. And that's why the book of Genesis reads so differently to us than it read to Moshi. I'm sorry, reads so differently to Ian Michael than it read to Moshi. But Ian Michael's a stand-in for us, obviously.
Just a really quick question as we move along. When does Moshi live? I suppose if he lived at the time of Moses, he might have thought something. And if he lived after the Babylonian exile, might he have thought something else, or perhaps not? What do you think?
That's an interesting question. No, Moshi lived about the time of Moses, and or for 200 or 300 years after that, the time of the monarchy, the time when we think the Pentateuch was probably transferred from oral memory to written, because the children of Israel, the Israelites, over a fairly short period of time, suddenly blossomed forth as a literary nation. It was a remarkable event, and it occurred about, well, roughly the time of the monarchy. So Moshe and King David maybe were contemporaries.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, what did Moshe sitting there expect to hear? Did he expect to hear cosmology? Did he expect to hear poetry? Did he expect to hear history of their nation or their tribe? What was his expectation? And then on the other hand, what's Ian's expectation?
Well, Moshe's expectation was fairly straightforward. He was interested in knowing how the sky above him, and remember when he looked up, he saw something we no longer see. He saw a dome, a blue dome, and he imagined that above the dome were the waters of chaos, the Tehom, this chaotic power that broke loose at the time of the flood. So he looked up and he saw the sky and he wanted to know where it had come from. And he looked down and he saw the ground underneath his feet, the land on which he raised his family, and he saw the sun come up every morning, and he definitely saw it move across the sky. None of this business of, no, the sun's stationary and we're moving, that was still 2,500 years ahead. So he wanted to know where the sky and the land came from. And that, for him, was everything, because he imagined that this blue dome above him was perched on the edge of the horizon. And so it came down and met the land. And within this dome and the land on which he lived, that there was a nether region under the world, Sheol, but he was pretty vague about that. But other than that, he wanted to know how the sky and the land had come into existence, and that was everything that he knew anything about. Now, Ian Michael, when he goes to Genesis, in that very first verse that you just finished reading, he's told that in the beginning, there's a definite article there that Moshe didn't hear. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And because earth is the name of the planet on which he lives, he wants to know, what about the other planets? If Genesis is talking about his planet, what about the solar system? What about the universe beyond? And so he goes to Genesis and expects to get an answer to questions of cosmology. That was not true for Moshe. Moshe had no idea that he lived on a sphere. He lived on flat land. Underneath was Sheol. Above it was this upside down basin, the blue dome of the Rakia, which is what God, the only thing that God created on day 2 of creation. It was absolutely essential because that held the waters above at bay, and in the space beneath, God could create the land. And that's what Moshe expected to hear. And that's what he heard, actually.
Okay, now did Moshe, living about the time of the monarchy, did he have any awareness of any other creation stories? Now we know that when they went into Babylon, they did encounter other creation stories, but here he is living about the time of the monarchy, about the time of King David. And at that point, does Moshe know any other creation stories?
My guess is that Moshe himself probably didn't. But if you're asking, were there some people in the court who did of King David? The answer is, yeah, almost certainly. But Moshe was a farmer. He's sitting out there in the desert, and he's got his little oasis and his tract of land. And so my guess is that Moshe himself didn't.
Okay. Let me back up and ask a broader question, and that is this. Why should I care what Moshe thought? And would I be pushing it too far to say that many people try to harmonize Genesis and contemporary understandings of the universe, but there's a sense in which you're trying to disharmonize them, show their difference, not how they could come together.
Good question. The reason, in fact, an excellent question, because that's you're putting your finger on the source of the pain that has existed between science and religion for 500 years. And that pain, that separation, has given rise to all sorts of problems. It's given rise to the creation museums around the country. We had the privilege of visiting the denomination's latest creation museum in the Galapagos Islands about 2 weeks ago. It was a fascinating visit. And I was talking with Carmen Lau about the visit. The institutes for studying the creation, all of the fuss and kerfuffle about fundamental belief number 6. Remember, 6 days making up a week such as we now experience it. All of that stems from people not asking the question, what did Genesis mean to the people to whom it was addressed?
Okay.
Writing down.
Yeah, I'm writing down something you said, and I want to come back to it, but go ahead.
No, I'm finished.
Okay. You mentioned belief number 6, and this is a bit of a detour, but we'll get back on topic in just a minute. I have figured out a way that I could sign that in good conscience, but I don't, because I think that I would be misunderstood. Here's a case where telling the truth would really be conveying a falsehood, and that is, when it comes to 24-hour days, I can say truthfully, I reject the idea that each day represents a great eon of time. And when it comes to 6 days, I'm rejecting the idea that there are gaps of significance between the days. And I can also say that it's recent. That is, the life and planet Earth is recent if one compares it to the life of the whole universe. So you can see how I could finesse that and sign it. But then, though I would be speaking truthfully to myself, I would be speaking falsely to other people. So I don't go ahead and do that. But
that all stems, the whole discussion would not have occurred if we had actually read Genesis the way Moshi heard it.
Okay, let's maybe ask for just one illustration, concrete illustration of how you've mentioned the large picture, the different ways of understanding causation, and also the different cosmologies. But is there one particular place that would be useful to highlight about these differences?
Well, yeah, let's start with the very first verse in the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, you and I have engaged, I'm sure, in dormitories and in Sabbath schools and with friends over Sabbath lunch over the interesting question, is that text in the beginning referring to the Big Bang? Right? You've had those discussions. I mean, is it really cryptically inspired seeing the future long before the future came? Is it talking about the positive singularity that erupted into reality as we know it? That whole discussion takes place because a translator inserted a definite article in that first sentence. The definite article is the English word the. There is no the in the Hebrew. And once you put a the, and I sort of picture the in sort of Arabic embroidered script in the beginning, you have a tendency to think that this may be talking about the beginning of everything, because it is a creation story and it's the first sentence. And so a translator trying to be helpful, has inserted that in virtually all English translations, but it's not present in the Hebrew. And so Moshi would not have heard that. What Moshi heard was something more like a translation that Fritz and I came up with, which is to begin with, which means simply we're going to start a story about how the sky and the land came into existence. So the insertion of that word, the Hebrew can't be translated directly into English. The Hebrew says, if you're going to do it literally, says beginningly. Well, you can't do that in English, or in beginningly. But it doesn't have the beginning that the English version does. And our contention was that doing that made the English version lead us down a pathway of these interminable discussions about whether or not the Big Bang is being referred to there. Shall I continue with that first sentence?
Yes, please.
Okay. Heavens. That's not exactly what the Hebrew says. What the Hebrew word is shemayim, and it means sky. And to Moshe, it meant sky. It meant the dome above him. Now, it's translated as sky in many other places in the Bible. So the translators knew full well that it could be translated as sky. But the moment you translate it as heavens, you are asking for things like starry heavens to enter the minds of the reader. And the moment you have starry heavens entering the mind of the reader, it's one short step to the universe. And there we've got it again. Now Genesis is telling us about the Big Bang and the universe simply because of the words that the translator used when going from Hebrew into English. And we'll talk about the next one for many, many more minutes, and that's earth. The Hebrew is eretz. It occurs many times in the Bible. In fact, so often that nowadays we can do statistical analysis on it. It is translated as earth, which of course morphs seamlessly into, now the Bible's talking about the planet on which I live. It could have been translated land. It should have been translated land. Eretz Israel is the land of Israel. Eretz was what was promised to Abraham and his descendants. And it certainly wasn't the world. It certainly wasn't the whole earth. It was land. But because our translators have given us, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. By the way, the definite articles are there. So if the translator wanted to put it in front of beginning, he certainly could have done so. So that's the kind of change that translating the Hebrew into English has made between Moshe's view and Ian Michael's view.
Are there other, no, this is a very specialized look at the text. It's a linguistic point. Are there other linguistic points like that that we should be attentive to? These are problems of translation. That's a more specific kind of issue than the big global worldview ones. But are there other translation issues like that? Those two, I should say.
Let's go back to the sentence you just said. That's a different kind of issue than the big global worldview. Fritz and I would argue that is where the big global worldview discord came from the choice of the translator. And the translator probably did this without knowing what he or she was doing. Remember that when a translator encounters a word in Hebrew and has to render it in English, they have they have to choose between 4 or 5 English words usually, some of which mean slightly different things. And the translator is obviously going to choose the word that matches the picture in his or her mind. So all translators in the last 500 years have had science in their mind. They've had nature and nature's laws in their mind. Ever since Galileo, they've certainly had Earth as a planet in their mind. So when they come to translate from Moshe's language into Ian Michael's language, what they're doing is picking a word that matches the picture they have in their mind. Well, if the translator is picturing Earth as a planet, or is picturing the Big Bang as being discussed in verse 1 of Genesis chapter 1, they're going to pick the words that most closely match their mental picture. And so, yes, the translation underlies this disparate worldview between Moshe and Ian Michael, and it's what gave rise to it.
Okay, I take that point, that the microscopic and the macroscopic are not different, but they're connected, one yielding the other, and the big one reinforcing the little one. Okay, I take that point. All right, now, so Ian, let's talk about Ian a little bit more. It sounds like he's a citizen of the United Kingdom.
Why so?
Well, those names sound that way to me.
Well, we hadn't pictured him attending Oxford, but okay.
Okay, so let's say he's at Oxford.
Maybe he's a contemporary of C.S. Lewis. Yeah, there we go. He's read C.S. Lewis. He's a contemporary of and C.S. Lewis was a denizen of both Oxford and Cambridge. So yeah, all right. He read.
I didn't realize that Ian had read C.S. Lewis, but let's work on that just a little bit. Having read C.S. Lewis, what would Ian think as he looked over Moshe's shoulder?
Well, what he's going to think is what is this mental picture. He's going to expect that this story is going to tell him about cosmology, cosmogony, the Big Bang, and because it's scientific, he knows that he lives on a planet. He's going to expect the author of Genesis to know that too. And apparently the author of Genesis does, because he talks about Earth. And of course, Ian Michael lives on Earth. What could be simpler? So that's what he's expecting to find, and that's what he will find. And that's why he's going to have some serious discussions about the universe. You know, was the universe here before the solar system came in? And was creation merely the tidying up of the solar system? Was there a previous creation on this planet? And now the creation story is talking about the second one. All of those discussions are based upon the picture in his mind as he reads Genesis. And he reads, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What he should be reading is, to begin with, God created the sky and the land.
Okay, suppose I'm there too, and I say to Ian, now, Ian, you're just missing the point. This is not a cosmology. This is not a cosmogony. It's a poem. And it's a poem that establishes the nature of the community that we should live in. It's sort of like saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created with these inalienable rights. We don't ask, when did that occur? What is the geological and biological reference to which this language is referring? It's a political, poetic statement. So one is, and Moshe didn't think of it as cosmology. That's the point. Moshe didn't think of that. Moshe thought it was a great story that he enjoyed thoroughly, but he was more interested in its literary impact on him. As he went home after hearing the story, he said, you know, that's a great story. If I can just diverge just a little bit. McKinley's going to laugh at this because I so often refer to Hawaii, but in Hawaii, they have a tradition which they call talk story. Now that's not good English, but what it means is, let's get together, let's have some food to eat, let's sing some songs, and then let's share stories. And one person will have this story and another person will have that story. And some of these stories came from the last week. Some of these stories came from something someone read. Some of these stories are quite cosmic. And people will say, wow, that's a good story, right? But they don't expect it to be subjected to the kind of scientific rigor that we're thinking that Moshe wants. Does Moshe really want that?
No, Moshe certainly doesn't want scientific rigor. If he did, he would be 2,500 years or more ahead of his time. Moshe wanted to know where the sky above his head and the land under his feet had come from. And he wanted to know that a good God had created them for his benefit, and that God would see to it that the sun, remember, God sent the sun in Moshe's world every day. God was responsible for getting the sun from where it set back to where it came up again. That was all what God did. God sent the rain. God did all of these things. And this is how God had created this world in which Moshe found himself. So he wanted
go ahead.
those questions.
I'm sorry.
Moses wasn't interested. I mean, so Moshe wasn't very poetic. He was a farmer. He grew yams and figs and things like that.
I'm going to press this just a little bit because I'm thinking Moshe's a kind of a desert poet.
No.
In the tribes, they sit around the campfire at night and tell stories. And the question is not so much what's the reference to the story, but whether the story is a great story and whether it sort of sticks in one's mind after one leaves. It's not to be understood.
Trust me, this story is the greatest story ever told. It's lasted for 3,000 years. It was recorded, and it was when the vellum or papyrus or whatever on which it was recorded decayed. It was re-recorded and then re-recorded again, and it has been re-recorded down through history. And it answered Moshe's questions. He wanted to know that God was interested in him, that God had created the land and the sky. And that's what this story did for Moshe.
Okay, so Ian listens to you and says, okay, now I realize that Moshe's not just a desert poet, but he's really interested in these cosmic questions. Now that I know that, I would need read Genesis not again. Obviously, it's part of a worldview that is no longer plausible. And I'm glad to know that it's part of a worldview that's no longer plausible, because I can put it on my shelf and move on to other things that are more worth my time, because it's clearly outdated. And then you say what?
Well, he would have said that it was clearly outdated had we translated it fairly from Hebrew into English. But because we have wanted it so much to be scientific, down through the last 500 years since the invention of science, we have routinely translated it so that it does sound scientific. And that's been the cause of the problem between Genesis as usually read and science as commonly understood. Now, all we need to do to get the picture of God that was painted for Moshe, after all, that was the important thing. Fritz insists on saying that Genesis is theology. And I think you've just made my point that Genesis is theology. It was theology for Moshe. It should be theology for us. It talks about his understanding. Now, of course, our understanding's got a bit bigger. We have the universe. We have a God that created a universe, but the God that created the sky and the land for Moshe was a God that created everything that Moshe knew anything about. The God that we know something about has created a universe with 100 million galaxies, each with 100 million suns, and on and on and on. And so it's theology. It is, yes, it's theology that was adequate to the task at the time, but we obviously will need to update it to find the same information, the same reassurance in it. But we need to know that as it was written, it said God was responsible for everything. It's still true.
Well, I was with you till you just said that. here I am, Ian, and I'm saying, okay, that sounds very plausible, but the idea of God as such is no longer plausible. So it's not as though we can extract the word God from this narrative and treasure it, but we have to deal with the narrative as a whole. And since we know it's totally outmoded, we need to get rid of that idea of God as well.
Oh, no, it's not totally outmoded. If it's theology, it's still valid. If it's outmoded only if we insist it's science. And what this whole discussion has been about is that it isn't science. It wasn't. It's theology. And as theology, it's far from being outmoded. It is the original story that people have told for 3,000 years, and it's still just as valid in that sense. It's telling us about God and how God was understood by Moshi, and therefore how God should be understood by us in our present world. It's outmoded only if you insist it's science, and we've, I think, agreed that it isn't. You can't outmode theology.
Excuse me, what was the last line?
You cannot outmode theology. You can only outmode it if it's science.
Well, I think we can outmode theology. I think we should not say some things theologically as our forefathers and foremothers did, but that's a little bit to the aside.
You can't outmode the statement that God is responsible for everything that is, and he created it for our benefit.
I could, though, if I were Daniel Dennett or Carl Sagan, I could.
Oh, yeah, if you're going to eliminate God entirely, sure. But if you're a theist, you can't. To be a theist is to be, in that sense, a creationist. If you believe in God, then you obviously believe in a creator God who's responsible for the world, the universe, the cosmos, and he was responsible for Moshe's sky and Moshe's land and Moshe's sun.
I wonder, yes, okay. I wonder if at that point, let's see, one would have to say to Ian, well, if this is the only text I had about God, or if this were the only information I had about God, that is Genesis 1, I probably would jettison the idea of God along with everything else. But since I have other reasons for affirming the actuality of God, then I can retain that part of the story while accepting the scientific datedness of the story. That's the only way I can think of as hanging on to the idea of God, but not hanging on to the rest of it. What do you think?
Again, you used the term scientific datedness. Have I not convinced you that it's not science?
Well, let me say, I am confused about this. And I need a clarification because on the one hand, I think I am being told that Moshe wanted a scientific explanation.
No, Moshe didn't want a science. Moshe had no idea about it. It was 2,500 years before science. Now let's talk a little bit about science. Science here is being used as an exploration of nature's laws and the developing the ability from a study of nature and nature's laws to predict, to get control over, to do all sorts of things. Once we understand nature and nature's laws, then we are in a better position to arrange our environment so that we can be more productive and life would be more comfortable. Science, let's get back to Moshe. Remember that there was only one active agent. There was no nature. There was no natural law. There was only God. Now, it's likely that Moshe viewed God as doing certain things routinely and other things exceptionally, but they were all God's actions. So God routinely brought the sun up every morning. God saw to it that the sun got from where it set to where it came up again. The nations surrounding the Israelites are worried about that. They had the sun in a boat going through a river underneath the earth. And remember, Moshi thought the earth was on foundations. And so God had to solve the problem of getting the sun through the earth's foundations in order to get it to come up every morning. But Moshi didn't worry about that. That was what God did routinely. God did all sorts of things routinely. God saw to it that married women would have babies. If they didn't, it was God who had closed the womb. So the kinds of things that God did routinely today, Ian Michael would almost certainly say, well, that's natural law. That's just the outworking of nature. The kinds of things that God did exceptionally, like freeing the slaves from Egypt and bringing water out of a rock in the desert, and the walls of Jericho falling, all of those sorts of things were what God did exceptionally. Now, those are the kinds of things that today a theist might well say God did. God, in fact, did. The rest, we would probably stick in the realm of natural law, the outworking of natural law. Let me give you an illustration. You go outside your house right now and you hear a huge bang. Your immediate response is, well, there must be some natural phenomenon that caused this, probably a supersonic plane went over. That's why this huge noise came from the sky. What would you have thought if you were Moshe? You would have immediately thought, that's God trying to communicate with me. That's the difference in worldview between Ian Michael and Moshi.
Okay, I have one more question before we take the break, but I wonder if there were some questions I should have asked, but didn't, that would have made it more possible for you to convey what you want to convey.
No. I think I think we have covered quite a few of the things that I was hoping, but we've just barely got started here.
Right. So we'll take a break and come back. But here's my last question before the break. What did you and Fritz want the reader to think and to feel upon the completion of your book? They've read it carefully, they've understood it, they've come to understand that there's a very big difference between the worldview of those who put together Genesis and the worldview that we now have. They've learned that lesson, they've learned it well, and therefore what?
We wanted them to understand that Genesis is entirely theology, and that if it's viewed as theology, and if the idea that it's science can be successfully eliminated, which you've, I think, demonstrated is very difficult to get rid of once it's once it's in your mind. It's theology, and it says it's theology. Everything that happened in Genesis says, and God said, or and God did, and it's now true. It's a far broader definition of theology than you and I would be comfortable with today, because theology is much more limited. But back then, because God was the only one of two active agents, the other one being humans, and there wasn't anything such as chance, God, well, let me give you, I think it's Proverbs 16:33. There it explicitly states that God controls the outcome of the throw of a die. Now, you and I would say, that's ridiculous. How could they possibly have believed that? But that's what the text says. It says the lot, which was their version of a dice, is cast into the lap, but Jehovah controls the outcome. Now, because they did not have chance in their mind, and they didn't have science, and because God controlled everything that humans didn't control, then you could make God speak when God wasn't otherwise willing to talk to you by casting lots. Because if there's only two active agents in the world, and you control one of them, you take it out of the control of humans, then it has to be under now the control of God. Now that's a notion that we find very strange indeed. And Fritz and I had several hours of long discussion about this, but eventually we came to an agreement that that's what the text says, and there's no getting around it. And that is presumably why they cast lots to determine where the tribes were going to settle. They cast lots to determine who was going to take the place of Judas, because that was a way of forcing God to speak. Well, that's the mindset that we need to get into if we're going to hear Genesis the way the author intended it to be heard. Now, obviously, once we've heard it that way, we then do the next step and determine what it now means to us. And you took us down that pathway already. So that's what we hoped. We hoped that people would now look upon Genesis as theology under a broad tent of theology, and that it would then keep us from these interminable discussions about the discord between science as commonly understood and Genesis as usually read.
That's so important, as science commonly understood and Genesis as typically or generally read. Mike, we've worked you very hard here for an hour. Let's take a break, and let's begin after the break by asking you if there's something you would like to add or subtract to what we've said so far. And then let's turn to questions about what you've said. Also, if it's not too burdensome, how about telling us a little bit about your trip to the islands, and if it changed your views, and if possible, in what ways they might have reinforced your convictions. So during the break, how about notifying Forrest if you have a question or a comment? I see Bob Ford has one which asks, what about the problem of evil in Moshe's view, and I gather in Ian's view? How would they respectively think about that? Okay, it's now for my time almost 11:35, so California time. So let's reconvene, get started at 11:45. Is that all right, Forrest?
Yes, that'd be great. Just have people raise their hand and I will put them in the queue.
Okay, now let's all go get something to refresh us and not have the best conversation during the break.
Okay.
Get a drink.
Is this a good time to get started for us?
Yes, it is. I have,
Okay, let's
I have-
begin by asking Brian if he has something he would like to add or subtract from what we've said so far. I think we need to unmute you.
I didn't hear the question. Could you
Yeah.
repeat it?
Is there something you would like to add or subtract or multiply or divide, whatever, before we move into the more general discussion?
No, I appreciate the questions you've asked and the discussion that ensued.
Okay, all right. Two comments. One, thank you so much for bringing Ian and Moshi along. They really have been wonderful guests, and I'm glad that you introduced them to us. The other thing is, if we're going to split science and theology that way, each one has to have its own method of verifying or confirming or disconfirming its claims. And so I worry about that a little bit, because that makes the two realms, I think the magisteria should be overlapping and not totally separate, but we'll talk about that later. Who's up to bat first, Forrest?
Okay, I'm going to go with Monty. Monty, you're a bat. Then I have Robert and then Peter after that.
Thank you.
Did you want to report on the Galapagos, or you? want
Yes,
to do
I'm
that
sorry,
later?
I forgot that. Yes, please do. Yes.
Can you hold Monty then?
Yeah.
Well, I actually have a prepared text for that, because those of us that had the privilege of going were asked to write something down about our response. In brief, 16 of us went on this trip, and we had the privilege of visiting the recently opened Creation Museum in the Puerto Ayora, the major city in Santa Cruz. And I think all of us found it very enjoyable. So I'll read just the 2 paragraphs of the write-up that I submitted. Given an opportunity to visit the recently opened Seventh-day Adventist Creation Museum in Puerto Ayora, Galapagos, I did not hesitate. It was both pleasant and rewarding. Museum displays included no dioramas. I had previously talked about dioramas in other creation museums, and the difficulty of displaying 3-dimensional life-size couple, Adam and Eve, because the Bible says that they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. But we'll skip that for the moment. The museum displays included no dioramas, no Adam and Eve, and no 3D dinosaurs. There had been a dinosaur looking at the couple bathing. Instead, perhaps as a stand-in for dinosaurs, there were pictures of the fierce-looking dragon-like marine iguanas that live in the Galapagos and nowhere else in the world. The museum proper consisted of professionally prepared posters of the physical laws, the mathematical equations that govern nature, and unique plants and animals that are to be found in these islands. The information was presented with a mixture of pictures and text, and the text was in both Spanish and English. Several of the presentations towards the end of the exhibit introduced the creation theme unobtrusively, almost hesitantly, by posing the question, what seems most reasonable, that this unique creature, plant, bird, etc., came into existence by chance, or that it was created by God? One of the last displays definitely caught my eye. It was a large poster-sized explanation of the Clotting Cascade, that aspect of physiology that keeps us all from bleeding to death. It too was very professionally presented. Since I, as an MD, spend most of my time seeing patients with disorders of the clotting mechanism, I was both surprised and delighted to find it in a creation museum. This was truly a first. This display, like the others before it, referred to the awe that the intricacies of the created world create in those who study nature thoughtfully. This responsive awe can be almost overwhelming in places like the Galapagos, where, surrounded by animals that appear completely oblivious to human presence, it is inevitable that the peaceable kingdom of that better world comes to mind. Still, since defects in the clotting system will eventually kill about 1 out of every 4 of us, that would be strokes, pulmonary emboli, heart attacks, bleeding disorders, I was left with mixed emotions by that particular exhibit. All in all, I liked the approach of this unusual creation museum and enjoyed it sufficiently so that when a second opportunity presented itself to me 3 days later, I returned to the museum to experience it once more. And that was my few paragraphs on our visit to the SDA Creation Museum in the Galapagos.
Wow, that's very, very well done. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you very much. Okay, Forrest.
Okay, I'm going to come back to Monty now. Monty, mute yourself.
Brian, thank you for your presentation. Both Lisa and I have been enjoying it very much this morning. What I'm struggling with is the change. You said that one has the perspective of theology and the other is science. And at the same time, you told Dave that, well, our definition of theology would be different now than back in the time of David, for example. Is there another word that we could use that would capture that better? Because we don't think of it just as theology, I don't think. He was trying to understand his world and where it came from. That's what you said. We do that scientifically now. I guess is the reason you're saying that's theology is because he knew it didn't come from man, and so it had to come from God, and so that's theology.
Yeah, that is a very good summary of what he was looking for. And of course the creation story itself says, and God did, and God said, and God said. Everything that happened is attributed not to science and not to Mother Nature, not to the outworking of nature's laws. It's directly attributed to God, because that was the only active agent that he knew of other than humans. So it's theology, but because it looks like science, and because science has now taken over those questions and answers them with reference to empirical data, we keep thinking of it. And I think you had a good illustration of that, because Dave kept reverting back to thinking of it as science, even though it's theology. It's theology of a sort that includes what God did routinely. And today, most of those things we would say are part of nature. But it's that switch that causes the problems between science and religion.
So it really, this has been really helpful, because it just as you've been talking, this has helped clarify this for me. It's not just the difference between science and theology, it's actually the understanding of the actors in their worlds along with those is critical to understand the perspective you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. And appreciate you for going over it and actually clarifying it as you talked. This is why I cited the text in Proverbs that says that something like the throw of a dice, which we attribute to chance, and we investigate scientifically, the laws of chance and that sort of thing, we wouldn't have any hesitation ascribing that to chance. Moshi didn't have that possibility. Chance had not yet, the idea of chance had not yet entered the human consciousness. And so the only active agents that he knew about were humans and God. And so if you took it out of the realm of humans, it had to be God. And that was, of course, why they cast lots. Something that had always puzzled me until I realized what was going on here. That's why they cast lots, to make major decisions, because that way they thought that they were getting it directly from God.
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, that little piece right there, why the lots are cast and stones on a breastplate, have always been very confusing to me. But in this, taking this world view into mind, it helps. It makes sense that if something's going to happen there, it wasn't me, it must be God. So it's a way of forcing God to reveal his will or make a choice. It's an interesting perspective and helpful.
Well, the text in Proverbs has always fascinated me. And I actually have acquired a die from that time period. It's made from the knuckle bone of a sheep, and it has little dots drilled into it. It's not a fair die by any means. Because it's so irregular, it almost always comes up with one or two numbers. But so I can't imagine what lots, because I think they were mostly broken pieces of pottery with something inscribed upon them. But I'm getting outside of that's archaeology, and I would refer that to some of my archaeology friends.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Robert Ford. Dr. Ford, to you.
Thank you, Brian. This was really helpful to me. I've always struggled, as I mentioned, I'm a geographer, geologist background, and I've struggled with reconciling these two worlds, and this helps a lot. But I'm still wondering a little bit about your definition, if I understood Monty's question as well. What do you mean by theology? Are you saying theology is anything and everything that is done by God? God as the actor, that's theology. Everything else is science. Is that what you're saying?
Close, but I would, if you permit me, I'd like to modify it slightly. Theology means words about God, theos and ology, logos. So the broadest definition of theology is words about God. And so words about who God is, what God does, what God wants from us would all be theology. And in this case, it's who God is and what God does that is the creation story. So in that sense, it is theology. It's words about God. And it's words about God at a time when science did not yet exist, would not yet exist for 2,500 years, more or less. We don't know exactly when Moshi lived, but if we assume it was 1000 BC and we're 2000 AD, then it's 3,000 years ago. But science has been around for 500 years, and we have all grown up with the assumption that much of what happens in the world is the outworking of the laws of nature. And that's been true for all people in the world for essentially the past 500 years. That's true, obviously, for Ian Michael. It was not true for Moshi. For Moshi, there were only two active agents in the world, only two agents that did things, God and humans.
Well, that's good. Okay, then how do you weave in, I had in my chat message, how do you weave in the actors of evil? Of course, the devil, theology, at least our theology of today and going back a long time, but many others, that there are other actors besides God that are not nature, that are not chance, that are not science. How do you integrate that together?
Well, you're asking a question that if I had Fritz, I would certainly turn it over to him. And maybe I'll turn it back to Dave. But I think, Dave, am I correct that the idea of the devil was still several hundred years in the future at the time Genesis would first have been written?
I think you're right. Maybe it, and John Jones can help us here too, but I think that notion comes largely from their encounter with the Babylonians.
I believe that's correct, but I'm definitely off my territory here.
I see John nodding his head. When the people of Israel were put into captivity, they encountered other world views, and some of them were very dualistic. So the devil emerges in biblical consciousness as a rival to God, but not one who is an equal to God. I think that's right.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you for that. Just one other little comment. The title of your book, you talk about sky and land, and I was really I feel very good about your using the word land instead of earth. As many of you know me, I'm a professor, but I'm also a farmer. I live on the land. I produce, or have orchard, and I produce hay, and I can understand Moshi understanding that there's a direct link between what happens in the sky, whether it rains or not, whether we have a drought or not, and whether we have a good hay crop or a feed crop. And that linkage to land and landscape, I think, is very helpful. And I appreciate your bringing that in instead of the word earth, which then brings in all these cosmological problems. So thank you for that. And if you want to comment any about that, I'd appreciate it.
Well, yes, I would like to say briefly, first of all, I agree entirely with you, and I think that you probably can get inside of Moshi's head more easily than the rest of us if you too live off the land. The choice, and it's a translator's choice between land and earth, as I mentioned earlier, has been made so often in the Bible that we can do a statistical analysis on it. And in the chapters that we're talking about, Genesis 1 to 11, 3 times out of, 9 times out of 10, when the Hebrew word for that is translated, the Hebrew word is eretz, when that occurs 9 times out of 10 in Genesis 1 to 11, it's translated as earth. In the rest of Genesis, and in the rest of the Hebrew Bible, when eretz occurs, it's translated as earth only 3 times out of every 10 occurrences. That's not due to chance. That's clearly a deliberate choice on the part of the translator that this word means earth in Genesis 1 to 11, and it means land anywhere else in the Bible. And I think that statistical analysis speaks for itself.
That's very good. My work around much of my life has been around anthropology, understanding people's connection with land. And that's something that transcends so many cultures. I think it's really important a concept that you help to bring in. So thank you for that. And I'll defer now to Peter and McKinley who have questions. Yes.
Before we do that, I noticed that John Jones had unmuted himself. Did you want to respond to one of those points, Dr. Jones?
Thank you, Forrest. Of course, there's always more to say, but it would have simply been a concurrence with what has been said already. There was a question in the chat right at that moment as to what we do with the serpent in the garden, and that would probably get us into all kind of tying ourselves up in textual and mythical knots where I would wind up saying that's a back projection from a later understanding or whatever. So I think we're best to move along. I simply wanted my mic unmuted in case I needed to jump in, but enough for the moment. There are other things I might come along with if time opens up. But I just want to say at the moment, Brian, I think these 2 characters that you and Fritz have helped us meet is an extremely useful and helpful trope, literary device for helping us really grasp, as those who are non-special to grasp this distinction.
Okay, thank you. I guess we'll come to Peter. You're up at bat now, Peter.
Can we mute David at B?
I got it.
Thank you.
Hey, Peter, unmute yourself. There you go. Oh, you're muted again. Now.
Thank you for the presentation. I have 2 questions. First, when Moshe heard the history of creation in Genesis, did he understand that God created ex nihilo, or he used water as a primordial element, or in other words, the elements were in existence and he just made order from chaos? And the second question, in the words of a Jewish rabbi, theology and science tell us two different things. Science tells us how the heavens go, and theology tells us how we can go to heaven. Then how can we consider that theology and science can be reconciled, can be harmonized, or just they complement each other? What is your view on this?
Again, I miss Fritz, but I see I've got John Jones, and I've got help from David, so I'm backed up here. As far as I know, the idea of ex nihilo would not have been present. I'm sure that Moshi wouldn't have worried about it, but the writer of Genesis, whoever he was, may well have been sophisticated or thoughtful enough to have been concerned about it. But I believe that the notion that God created out of nothing does not appear until the intertestamental period, and it shows up there for the first time. So that would have been well, maybe 1,000 years later, before that idea was commonplace. And as for geology and science, I'm not sure that I understand. Geology is a scientific discipline. Well, I think you probably meant something else. Geology and science are part and parcel of each other.
Well, making the difference, considering that everything that was created by God, and the science just explains how the things were made.
Oh, okay. I think I see. Yes, this was one of the most famous occasions in which the gulf between science is commonly understood and Genesis, as usually read, occurred. Galileo before the tribunal. Yes, we understand that, meaning that yes, we're perfectly happy with science explaining all sorts of things, because as theists, we believe that God is responsible for science. That would not have been true, obviously, prior to the time that science came to exist. So it would not have been true. It would not have been something that Moshi could have mentally manipulated. We can, because the notion of nature and nature's laws, and the working out of nature under God's leadership. That's something that we deal with in the modern world as theists all the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will.
Could I ask John Jones if creation ex nihilo? I think it doesn't appear until the intertestamental period.
That is correct. The very expression being in Latin, not being in Hebrew, already gives us a hint of our answer. There's an absolutism about that expression that I think complicates the issue for us. For example, with regard to Peter's very interesting question, we, from our perspective, we glide over the surface of the text and miss the implications of the verse that says, "Let the waters bring forth all kinds of living creatures." Is the water itself a primordial actor? And in carrying out the divine will here. Of course, all of this is excluded by our ex nihilo understanding, but the text is richer and more layered than we think.
Thank you.
All right, I will now go to Donna. Donna, you're working under your own name now, not Jeff.
Well, I hide sometimes behind Jeff, and then he gets a little upset. I wanted to put in a word for Moshe. It seems to me that he was asking a scientific question and not necessarily a theological one. He just didn't have maybe enough tools to, but he wasn't just a farmer. We tend to use that to minimize his experience or his role. This is someone who is presumably dealing with the elements, with growth, with the soil. He figures out that things grow better here than over there. And whether he attributes that to God makes this land better than that land, he doesn't have, and I think science is much older than 500 years. I was throwing Aristotle out the window along with more ancient Greeks to suggest that that we are. I think we're caught a little bit in a sort of chronological arrogance to think that now we are at some kind of pinnacle of understanding the world. And the reason I think that's maybe dangerous is because the more we know, the more we're tempted to, God's jurisdiction gets narrower and narrower as we move into till we get to the point where we understand everything, and God doesn't really have any role anymore. Do you see the problem, or do we see the problem? I don't know if anybody at this class, for instance, believes that God or some great spirit or mind behind the universe just created human beings out of, some dust to the ground. So I think we recognize that SCI, the thinking, the intelligence, the questioning of the attitude toward the world is an old phenomenon, an old human phenomenon. And but we recognize, yes, we know more, but I get a little bit concerned about dividing this sort of real division between theos and science. That's all. I don't know if that hangs together very well, but I that's my concern. I think that Moshi was asking scientific questions. I think the person who wrote his story down had more information. I think that Ian is more sophisticated than he or she was. The cartoon figures are helpful, but I think that maybe they obscure the process a little bit.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I realize that I have not done nearly as good a job as I should have. No question that that questions about nature and information about nature, questions about nature were asked from the beginning of the Bible story, and obviously long before that. I was limiting science to the derivation of empirical data to establish something. People obviously understood that you planted a seed, and if you, as the native Indians in America very quickly learned, if you put a fish head in with the corn seed, you got a much better crop. Moshi, we assume he was a farmer, knew all about that sort of stuff. And he was in fact answering a question of nature. He was asking a question of nature. But the definition of science that I was using, I should have been much more clear, was the acquisition of empirical data to answer questions of nature. Does that help any?
It helps.
Okay.
We'll,
Thank you.
we'll talk again.
Yeah, well, it's the science that started 500 years ago was basically to take empirical data and buttress what had previously been opinions. And opinions about nature certainly have existed, about natural events have certainly existed since time began. But it's the experiment repeatable, repeated experiment to standardize opinion. That's what I'm using to the term empirical data to refer to. And that, Moshi, I do not believe had any idea of how to do that, or nor did he have any data from that kind of work, because it was still 2,500 years ahead in the future. And that's what is what Ian Michael relies upon for most of what he knows about nature. If he's a scientist, then he'll look at the original works. If not, he'll probably check Wikipedia. But in both cases, what he's getting is a report of experimental empirical data that confirms what the person making the statement is saying.
Okay, thank you. I am now going to go to McKinley. McKinley, congratulations. You learned how to raise your hand.
So I don't have to fill that can of gratuities anymore for you. But thank you. Before I make my comment and ask a couple of questions, Dr. Bull, I want to just piggyback onto Donna's observations. And as I've observed before in this class, I think that theology and quote unquote science are part of the same knowledge continuum. I think that not with respect to your presentation necessarily, but attempts to separate the two, I think are artificial. So it seems that the discussion brings out the important point of the Genesis account, which is this: in the beginning, God created, or as you transliterated it in a different way. I'm not remembering how you put it, but at the beginning.
To begin with, God created.
To begin with, yes. To begin with, God created. I think that's an important point. But I also like to observe that there are other passages in the scripture that refer to the creation account. Jesus refers to the creation account in Matthew, Psalms 33, Job 38, 39, amplify the Genesis account. So one question would be, how does the Moshi Eon construct account for those other reports of the origin account? So that's the first question. I don't know if you want to deal with that now before I go on to my other points.
No, let me deal with them one at a time.
Thank you.
Otherwise I got to write things down. This was the understanding of how all things began that was prevalent in the Hebrew nation, and is still the foundation of Christianity today. Certainly, it would have been read and understood and would have been believed in by all subsequent people at the time of Christ, and obviously down to today. Clarify for me, if you would, exactly why this wouldn't be what you would expect.
So, for example, I think Job was supposed to be the first book written before Genesis. Is that correct for the theologians in the class? But Job 38 goes into great detail about how the creation came about. Psalms 33 talks about the mechanism of creation, God's articulation, for example. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But again, if one takes all of those together, the question then again is, how would those fit within this construct of Mr. Ian and Moshi? So I want to go on to the second observations. So the second important point of Genesis for me is that it establishes a boundary condition about the creation outcomes, the seventh day Sabbath. Now, putting aside the perspectives of Moshi and Ian, when I take the 30,000 view of cosmology and origins through a thermodynamic prism and pull together the knowledge concepts of origins presented in the Bible, I find an alignment with physical observation and the articulations that are presented in some of those passages that I mentioned before. And that is without any spiritual or theological consideration, okay? So this for me then suggests that a disagreement doesn't necessarily exist between theology and the four causal factors that were talked about earlier, God, humans, nature, and I think chance you said. But it presents for me an understanding gap of the people that are sort of studying this phenomenon. So where does thermodynamics fit into the Moshi-Ian framework?
Well, clearly as knowledge developed, the understanding of why there's something rather than nothing, to generalize the question, it got more detailed and more sophisticated, and that has occurred down through time, and we understand a great deal more about the size of God's creation now than did Moshe. And the problem between science and religion has centered for 500 years on the creation story. I think largely, well, my point is that it's the problem is centered there because we have erroneously insisted on reading it not as theology, but as science. And if it's science, then it states some things that we know scientifically now to be unlikely. But the understanding of why there's something rather than nothing, which is a question I suppose all human beings down through history would have asked, has gotten significantly more sophisticated. And our understanding of the God that created all of this has gotten sufficiently, has grown. I think, as I mentioned earlier, our God has created a universe with 100 billion galaxies and 100 billion suns. That's the God as we understand today. The God that Moshe understood was responsible for the sky and the land. And that was everything that he knew about. So his God was responsible for everything that he knew about. And our God is responsible for everything that we know about. And so our creation story is obviously going to be more populated with interesting details, one of which I suppose would be thermodynamics.
Great. So I've got another point, but I'll let other people speak, and then maybe if we have some time after class, I can follow up with those. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, McKinley. David, I'm going to go to David here, and I have two other hands up, but they've had questions before, and I'm looking at the clocks. So do you have any counsel in regards to that?
Yes, are you talking to me, Forrest?
No, I was talking to David, talking to
Or
David.
David Larson?
David Larson. Oh, wait a minute. I'm talking, excuse me. I got, all right, David, David V, you asked your questions or comments.
Yeah, I just had a brief comment. I wondered, there's been some concern about the word theology as it pertains to Moshi. Was Moshe's perspective theological? And I'm wondering if it wouldn't be easier and more acceptable to just consistently say that his view was theistic, because theological suggests a system of thought, a system of study. And I don't think that Moshi had that with his view of God creating land and sky. It seems to me that it was a fairly simple, straightforward belief, and therefore perhaps theistic would be a more accurate word to use consistently there. What do you think, Brian?
Well, I see your point. And whoops, I think that David, I think, I agree. Theistic. David, I think, you'll need to mute while I answer.
Muted.
Okay, thanks. The term theistic probably in today's parlance would be cleaner and clearer. I was just simply going with the etymology of the word theology, which means simply words about God, but it has come to mean a formal system, an organized system of taking those words about God and putting them in systems, hence systematic theology and various other kinds. But I'm way above my pay grade here, talking about theology as a discipline. So I'll cease and desist. But I take your point. Theistic in today's parlance probably would be clearer and cleaner.
Okay.
Thank you.
David Larson, we are at the bewitching hour. I have two more hands up, but they've already asked their questions today. Should we continue, or do you want to terminate at 12:30?
I think we should keep faith with Brian and with each other and conclude at this point. I will leave Zoom on for those who want to continue the conversation about this or anything else. But we have worked, Brian, very hard, and I think that we should conclude at this point. With thanks to everybody. Thank you very much. We will reconvene with regard to the second book in this trilogy next week. And if there are things we need to update from this conversation, we will do so at that time. Okay, here we go. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Are you going to hang around for a little bit?